Good morning. Well, I've been hearing about this conference and I've been really intrigued by it for a number of years, so I was really grateful to get the invitation to participate this year, and I'm delighted to be here with you this morning. I want to first thank Ed Costa for his, what I thought was excellent presentation on Tuesday morning. He helped me categorize what I'm going to be talking about, namely stance, into the right thinking skill. So what I'm going to be talking about, I think, comes under the category thinking about your thinking. So, first thing I'd like to do with you all is share what I'd like to accomplish with you over the next hour. And as the title of the session suggests, we're going to be talking about this notion of stance, the definition, and why it's important for the practice of leadership. We're also going to be I want to give you a chance to become more aware of your own stance and how that, what you're achieving in your own leadership context. Thirdly, a little bit more practice in terms of maybe adopting a stance or stances in a situation that might enhance your leadership influence. And lastly, but not least importantly, talk a little bit about how you might actually integrate stance into your own leadership practice. You'll notice that 3 out of these 4 require your participation. So I've thought a lot about how to go about doing this. And I realized I could kind of regale you with stories about the power and impact of stance, and I'll do a little bit of that. But I think for you to really learn about stance, you need to kind of try it on, so to speak. So that's what I'm going to try to do, and I hope you're up for the participation. My hope is that you'll leave here at the end of the hour with something that's of practical value that you can actually apply in your own leadership and life context. So, first of all, what do we mean by stance? And why is it important? Well, the traditional English definition of stance is a publicly stated opinion, or literally how you stand. It's a posture. And my colleagues and I have kind of expanded the definition somewhat. It's related to this, but broader, to mean how you hold yourself in a given interactive context, the state of your mind kind of internally, but also what's going on with your body. Now, there are probably an infinite number of stances that you could adopt in any particular interaction. You could adopt a listening stance. You could adopt an angry stance. You could adopt an aggressive stance, an action stance, a reflective stance. It's probably true that there may be an ideal stance for any given interaction, but the truth is, most of us, most of the time, are nowhere near operating our maximum stance, so to speak. So, before I go any further, I want to give you a chance to look at this, your own stance. So, I would like you to preferably just with the person next to you, and I have one caveat here. since we're going to be doing these interactive things a couple more times, probably would be helpful if the person and you spoke the same language. So get with a partner, and I'll just give you a minute to do this, and I want you to introduce yourself to one another, and then I want you to share what your stance is at this particular moment. So what's going on inside and what's going on in your body. So go ahead, take a minute to do that. Find a partner and just share that. Okay. All right. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Interesting way of getting to know one another a little bit. So, why is stance important in the practice of leadership? Well, we know from research and also just our everyday experience that where you are on the inside determines what you take in, all the information you take in. And then, of course, your body language, what you're embodying at any moment certainly affects the people around you. So, if you want to be an effective leader, it's really important to know what your stance is. And if you can actually be intentional about it, you're probably going to be a better leader and a better influencer. Another fact is that we're always in one stance or another. We may not be and probably aren't aware of what the stance is, but we're always in some kind of stance. So another fact is that we just don't think about it that often. In fact, Otto Scharmer, who's done a lot of work, written a number of books. How many of you are familiar with the U theory, Otto Scharmer's work? Raise your hand. Not that many. Okay. He's done some wonderful work over the years, and he says the blind spot of leadership is the inner place from which we operate. I tend to agree with that. It's certainly true in Western thought. I'll share a little bit a story. When I first started to realize that this issue of stance was pretty important, I started to do some research on it. And I couldn't find much written about it at all in Western literature. So I was really excited. I thought, wow, fresh thought, really, this is all new. But a colleague of mine from India said, well, Jeff, no, not really. They've been writing about this for a couple thousand years, mostly in Sanskrit. So on the one hand, that kind of broke my balloon. On the other hand, it's kind of affirming to know that people have been thinking about this for a long, long time. By the way, since I used Otto's quote, I want to brought his book. It's the best leadership book that I've read in about a decade. It's called Leading from the Emerging Future, from Ecosystem to Ecosystem. So if you want to learn something in a good read in the area of leadership, check this book out. This next quote: "The success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener." This was a quote from Bill O'Brien, who was CEO at Hanover Insurance. And this is what he said really got me thinking about this. A lot of the work that I do is executive coaching and leadership consulting. So work with a lot of groups. And I noticed when I would go in to do a workshop or a coaching session, if I was stressed, if my plane was late, or maybe I was distracted by something that happened to me recently, when I'd go into the workshop with some anxiety, I noticed that people, it didn't always go so well, and it was almost like they caught my anxiety. I'm getting some nods. So I started to wonder about that, and I thought, well, okay, I wasn't using the word stance at that time, but I thought, well, maybe if I center myself before I go into a workshop or a coaching session, that things might go better. So that's become a habit for me. I really try to take some time to sort of relax, settle myself before I go in. And it turns out that now, fairly recent neuroscience brain research, they've determined that we each have what they call mirror neurons that in fact pick up what other people are feeling. So that the fact that it is a fact that your feelings get picked up by other people. So our stress is contagious. I want to share another story, a little bit more personal story, about stress, about stance, kind of in my life. Any of you have raised teenagers, you might, I think, will be able to relate to this story. My daughter was 13 years old, and she kind of had the attitude. The attitude was her parents knew nothing. And I was having a series of really frustrating conversations with her. And, I certainly was frustrated, and I thought she probably was pretty frustrated as well. So I began to think about, okay, how am I holding her? And I realized what I was coming into those conversations kind of holding on the inside was obnoxious teenager. And so I thought, well, wait a minute now. She's my daughter. She's really smart. She's got a great sense of humor. She's got a very kind heart. And she is my daughter, and I really love her. Maybe I should kind of take a more loving stance in my conversations. So in our next conversation, I think, came into that conversation with a different stance. And I'll tell you, it was magic. Somehow the angst, the tension, just sort of dissipated. And we've been having good conversations pretty much ever since. Now, it could be that she sort of grew up in that moment or something, but I don't think so. I think it really had something to do with where I was coming from. My colleagues and I have been doing a course that we call Coaching from a Systems Perspective. And we've been doing the course literally all over the world, in Japan, Romania, done it a number of times in India, in the US, the UK. And we do evaluations after the course for the participants. And we've realized some interesting things from that research. And, we realized that we were teaching kind of the most familiar things, knowledge, concepts, theories, vocabulary, instead of kind of what they needed to know. Also tools, some things about how to go about things, recipes, so to speak, and also giving them a chance to practice, coaching in simulated cases. But we also introduced this notion of stance. Didn't get a lot of data. It was only a 3-day course followed by some phone conversations, so not a lot of data on changing anybody's identity. But interestingly enough, we got a lot of feedback around stance. People from every culture seemed to relate to this, and it seemed that it really had a positive impact on their awareness and effective as coaches, as leaders. In their professional situations, but also in their lives. One example that came to me, one of the participants said she spent a lot of time in rush hour traffic, an hour and a half each way to work and back. And her stance in that, she realized, was, anger, frustration, and was really having a hard time. So she decided that she would kind of use this notion of stance and see if she could shift that. So she shifted that in terms of planning what stance she would take in her relationships with her husband and her kids. And so she used that time in a much different way and, really felt like, wow, it's sort of changed my life. Maybe a bit of a trivial example, but powerful at the same time. A couple other things that we've realized about stance. One is that it's really critical that your stance is coherent. What I mean by that is what's going on inside is consistent with your body language. If you've ever been in a conversation with someone that really, you got these kind of messages that they were really nervous, but somehow they were trying to act confident, so they were kind of coming from a different place than their body was saying. It's really confusing for people. So that coherence seems to be a critical issue. Another thing that we discovered is that it's good to have notes. All leadership interactions aren't created equal. And I want to be sure to say that we're not saying that you should think about stance constantly for every interaction. But I think where it's important is where there's an important meeting coming up or an important conversation that you really want to go well, that you want to have some positive influence around. That's when this notion of stance is really important. So with that in mind, I'd like to sort of do step 2 here and have you try on stance for yourself, so to speak. So I'd like you to get with the same partner that you shared your stances with and introduced yourself at the beginning here. And I'd like you to first each think about a recent conversation, leadership context, meeting, etc. Could be a group or one-on-one or family context, professional context, where you wanted to achieve some particular outcome, where your effective leadership would have been helpful. And, in dyads, with your partner, share that and have your partner ask you these questions. What was your stance in this particular interaction? What impact do you think it had on the situation? And do you assume a predictable or usual stance in your role as a leader? One of the things we also learned is sometimes our stances get habitual. We find one that maybe we grow up with and we go in as almost a default. So do you take a particular stance as a leader? So I'm going to give you about 4 minutes each to share this. Person A share this with their partner, and then in about 4 minutes, I'll tell you when to switch, and we'll do another 4 minutes, and then come back with your attention here. So go ahead. How'd I do? So, how'd I do? Okay, if you haven't already, switch so the other person has a chance. Okay. Okay, one more minute, one more minute. Okay. Quite animated conversations. I think that's a good sign. So, just time for a couple responses here. So, what did you learn from talking to your partner? Anybody willing to kind of share just a little bit from what you got out of that conversation? Anyone? I'll repeat it.
We've been talking and she was asking me about the solution, but I think it's not my duty to give her the solution. She's missing herself any solution, so it's just being there and asking her to think in different ways.
So you didn't have any idea about the solution, so realized you needed to be thinking in a different way. All right, and any other quick comments? Over here?
Sometimes when you have a difficult meeting,
Yes, difficult meeting.
you live it, and you think that everything is happening, but everything that is happening, in reality is what is happening inside you. It's not the reality.
Aha.
You live it because you are in a stance, no?
Yeah.
Negative stance, and you think maybe all of them are enemies against your ideas,
Aha.
but maybe not. They are.
Yeah. So you're in a tough meeting, and you leave the meeting thinking like, wow, they're all my enemies in that meeting. And that may be only in your mind, nobody else's. I think that's exactly right. Okay. Next, I just want to talk briefly about a methodology, so to speak, of initiating and embodying a stance for yourself. And I also want to make the point that in any interaction, it's unlikely that you might want just assume one stance. Almost any even one-on-one conversation probably would require several stances. So keep that in mind. So anyway, here, I just want to share, as I said, kind of a methodology. And here's my disclaimer about this. There isn't any right way to do this. It's really more a matter of what works best for you. This is what works for me, and this is what we taught in the course, and it seemed like it worked for a number of other people. So I'll share that with you. But again, try it on, and maybe not. So the first kind of step in the process is awareness. Thinking about your thinking. Become aware of what your current stance is. Where are you at this very moment? Just like you did in that very first exercise. Again, we're often not thinking about that. And in both the state of your mind, but also your body. How's your body feeling? And then the second sort of step is one of intention. And that involves, in a particular, you might envision a leadership situation. It could be a teaching situation. It could be a meeting. It could be a one-on-one conversation where you really want to have a positive influence on the person or group. And envision the stance or stances that you want to hold in that particular situation. And I think this is really, this is an important point for me. This is what I was referring to earlier about, I think it's really helpful to do this almost in a meditative or at least a quiet, relaxed state. So by yourself, or at least where you can really focus on envisioning the future and what's going on inside yourself. And then just before you engage or just before you get into the meeting, and pay attention to what your stance is going in. And then envision the stance that you want, stance or stances that you want to hold in that situation. Now, this is really what I found kind of magical about this, that once you envision the stance that you want to be in, that when you're actually in the interaction, it just emerges naturally. You don't have to think about it. It'll just kind of manifest, which is kind of nice. So you actually embody it in the interaction itself. So I want to give you a little practice at this. So I'm going to ask you to just relax in your chair, and just kind of be quiet, center yourself, be aware of your breath, slow down, and just bring your awareness to your current stance. How are you at this very moment? How are you inside? What are you feeling? And how's your body? Now I want you to envision, hopefully, some high leverage interaction, some important meeting, conversation that you want to have, preferably, in the fairly near term, next week or two maybe. And direct your whole attention there. And imagine the physical setting that you'll be in. Imagine the people that you'll be talking with and who you'll be interacting with. And just get that picture in your mind. Now imagine embodying the stance or stances that you'll take that you feel would be most effective in that particular conversation or interaction. The ones that would most positively influence this particular leadership interaction. Okay? Envision what you can embody. Okay, and just notice it doesn't take a real long time to do this, something that you can just kind of integrate. So, back to, back to your partner. And what I first want you to do is share the context that you have in mind in this future interaction with your partner. And do this quickly, just a sentence or two, just 1 minute, so they have some idea about, what the situation is. And then I want you, this may be ambitious, but I want you to see if you can practice actually being the stances that you envisioned. So you can kind of role play or just sort of practice this while embodying the stances that you just envisioned a couple seconds ago. And give each of you about 3 minutes to do this, and so I want each partner to have it. So about 4 or 5 minutes each, and then we'll take a couple minutes to debrief again. So go ahead. One, two, three, 4, 5 levels. Okay. Okay. Relax, clear. Okay, if you haven't already, switch so your partner gets a chance. Okay. I wasn't done. I wanted people to switch. Okay, you're done? Okay. Okay. All right. I'm wondering how many of you were able to think about an important kind of leadership interaction coming up for you? Just put your hands up. Yeah, so most of you had those up. Okay, so how did you do in terms of kind of role-playing or embodying the stance, taking the stance that you wanted to take there? Any comments about that? How'd you do? Anybody? I don't know what this means. Well, go ahead.
It kind of followed the conversation we had before about the stunts and how we were influenced in our own stunts by the stunts of other people in front of us.
Yes.
And by being aware of that, we started thinking about how to face this next special interaction that we're going to have in the coming days or weeks. Being aware of the stunts of others and making sure that that stunts does not affect ours. That was a very positive thing.
Yeah, great. Really important, because often what happens in these difficult conversations or meetings is we just react, and we get defensive, or we get angry, or we get upset. And that usually doesn't help. It just makes things worse. So if you're really aware of your stance and are a little bit prepared not to do that, and say if you thought about, well, it really helped me to stay relaxed and not be reactive in this situation, you're much more likely to succeed at doing that. So that might kind of make the conversation go a little bit better, or at the least you won't be part of the problem. Anybody else? Okay, well, I want to thank you for just your cooperation in doing this. The last thing I want to talk about is, okay, so how can you integrate this in your own leadership practice after you leave here? So let me ask you, how many of you will be going to another session sometime today? Hands? All right. Just about everybody. Okay, good. Here's my homework assignment. Since these sessions for you all are probably not high leverage or not anxiety provoking, so it's actually a good time to practice stance. I'd ask you to think about, what stance do you want to adopt, embody in the next session you go to? You might want to adopt a listening stance. You might want to adopt a listening and engage stance. But what would help you in terms of maximizing your experience during your next session? So that's what I'd ask you to do, in addition to the example, the high leverage thing that might be happening after the conference sometime. So, all right. So in conclusion, my hope was that, like I said, to give you something that you could practically apply in your own life, in your own leadership practice. So I hope I've done that, and thank you very much for your cooperation, and it was a pleasure to do this for me. Thank you.